Family and fellow soldiers, I'm the Professor, and this is the Moment of Truth. Dr. King once said that injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. But I say that the opposite is also true. If a bastion of justice is allowed to exist anywhere on any part of this planet, it becomes a threat to injustice everywhere. Why? Because it stands as an example to the rest of the world of how the good guys can take control of their own lives. It shows them that the way the world is not the way that humanity actually has to be. It's the way that it's forced to be. And that if people start putting the arm on the bad guys, we can actually change it to what it should be. Right now, California's lawmakers are considering a bill that would create a genealogy office to determine who's eligible for reparations. If the bill becomes law, it would establish the California American Freedman Affairs Agency. Well, you gotta like the name if nothing else. Freedman indeed. Just goes to show that these people out there in California, they see the stuff that's being said by those of us online, the people who have been speaking about this for the longest time. They hear what's being said by the black folks who are on the internet. They see it. And that being the case, they're trying to glom onto it, at least because they feel it's going to give them legitimacy. But I say we still keep an eye on them regardless. And speaking of keeping an eye on folks, you gotta love how Fox News decides to turn every one of their so-called news pieces into nothing more than a thinly veiled editorial. They're claiming that reparations are a handout. No, the system of racial goodies, giveaways, and guarantees that white supremacy has given to certain people, that's the handouts. The Homestead Act, the taking of black land after Reconstruction, U.S. government programs for white veterans of both world wars, programs that blacks were completely and thoroughly shut out of, using money from black urban centers to pay for the establishment of whites-only suburbs, banks who accepted deposits from black patrons, but then who engaged in redlinings and systematically denying loans only to those same black patrons. People who the government and corporations gave things to that they didn't earn at the expense of those who did. Those are the handouts. So California establishing a genealogy office, they haven't done it, but they're considering the legislation. In principle, this is good, though, of course, as you know, the language about up to the 19th century, people whose ancestors were here up until that point, obviously that is beyond problematic, but at the very least, it makes it where the flood of tethers who came in 50 years ago aren't considered, so that being the case, it's certainly a hell of a lot better than it would have been. But you notice how the language from the detractors has changed? This is from Fox News, the premier white supremacist broadcast mouthpiece. The California bill defines a descendant as descendants of an African-American chattel enslaved person in the United States or descendants of a free black person living in the U.S. prior to the end of the 19th century. Now keep in mind, for many years, especially since we started making reparations into an actual issue, you've had the white supremacists, the tethers, and the bootlicks who have pretended not to know how eligibility for reparations would be determined. Oh, how would you know who gets what? Well, who would it be based on? Playing all these little word games, pretending like they don't know. Well, how would you evaluate it? I'd love to see those clowns now. Aren't they going to keep pretending that it's impossible to know who's a descendant of an American slave? Aren't they going to be claiming that there's no way to know? Shouldn't they be dragging out that line of BS now? Yeah. Doesn't sound so good now that things actually start moving, because the reason that they were saying all that stuff and giving all of these phony denials and pretending that they didn't know what was because they were hoping people would become confused. But over here, we are laser focused. We know exactly who's eligible and who's not, and they know it too. But what they think is that they're going to throw up some white noise, and apparently that's going to drown us out, but it hasn't. Now keep in mind, at this point, it's just a bill. It has not been passed into law. But the thing that's important is this is pretty much putting in place that genealogy, reparations based on lineage, is indeed the direction this is going to go, and as goes California, so goes the nation. The bad guys are terrified of the precedent that this sets, not just in the U.S., but also abroad. And speaking of foreign-born black folks, the work that we've done here has translated into the UN, making some vague croakings about reparations for African states in general. Reuters says, quote, support is building among African and Caribbean nations for the creation of a tribunal to address reparations, which might include financial payments. Now, how is it that you got African and Caribbean nations who are not automatically pounding the table for reparations? Why is it that they got to come up with a tribunal to address reparations, that support is building for it? You mean you don't already have huge support now? You're not already eagerly in favor of it? And to say that it might include financial payments, of course, this is coming from Reuters, one of the main white supremacist little mouthpieces, so of course they're going to be throwing that kind of language in there. But my question is, how far off the mark are they really, given the behavior, or rather the reluctance, of African nations to step forward for what they believe that they're owed? They're ambivalent about whether they should get money for the wrongs that the Europeans did to them. Well, their leaders over there in Africa are never ambivalent about whether they should get money from these same white nations, which usually winds up in a Swiss bank account somewhere. This is all suspect as hell what the UN is saying, these little intimations that maybe we're thinking about reparations for these guys. But regardless, we all know the real reason that these UN figures are making insincere talk. We know why they're doing it now. Everyone's seen what we've been doing, and now more people in Africa are getting agitated. Do you think that it's just some kind of lucky coincidence that both the story about California's Reparations Genealogy Office proposal and the UN talking about reparations regarding these African countries, both of these stories came about in the same 24-hour period? You think that that was just happenstance? That it just fell that way, it just happened to be like that? No, as I've been telling you for the longest time, nothing happens in a vacuum under white supremacy. Everyone has seen what we've been doing, and you've had a lot of these folks in Africa who usually are just quiet. They've been getting a little bit agitated. The work that we've been doing has been putting a spine in people's backs. When they see us getting something, that makes them feel like they should have already gotten something long before us. Let's just be real about it. For the UN to be talking about reparations, it's clear that they're trying to do an international version of the same con game that the white supremacists in the US have been running here. They're going to try to redefine what should constitute reparations, and they want to make sure that it never translates into cash payments directly to the victims of colonialism. But then again, when we say victims, though sometimes I feel that where certain parties over there are concerned, the word victims ought to have an asterisk beside it. All of those African countries owe us a debt of gratitude, and what they also owe us is the freedom to travel freely within the continent, and land and resources as well. That's an issue that also needs to be broached. We have done the most for Africa, and we've been treated the worst by those same nations. They ought to be jumping at the chance to welcome us with open arms. If we were to establish an economic base there, we would do a hell of a lot more for them than their own misleaders have done. And whether anyone wants to hear it or not, we would also do better than the native population has done for themselves. We don't have the tribalism and empty ethnic boasting that has paralyzed these nations from being able to work together. One of the biggest problems that Africa has is that everybody splits themselves up according to their little tribes or little ethnic groups. And it is precisely this rampant factionalism over there that's allowed everyone from the Western Asians to the Romans to the Persians to the Europeans to the Arabs to the Chinese and everyone else to just freely rape Africa for millennium. And rather than fix the situation, a lot of folks chose to flee instead. And then, in order to make up for the embarrassment of having to flee, they decide to dump on us, the very people who didn't do anything to them, the very people who helped them to get here in the first place. You can tell that that eats away at a lot of folks from over there. They get over here and they feel some kind of way and they look at themselves and they see somebody who fled. And they look at us and say, well, we know that that's what you see too, so we're going to dump on you as a way to bolster our confidence. Wrong move. And speaking of which, there's been some loose talk about how any reparations effort for Africans should also include Haiti as well. Billions of dollars for Haiti. Nice idea, everyone's crying tears for Haiti, but the truth is the continent of Africa is in similar shape. Had the attitude of the African leaders, or at the very least their populations in general, been different towards us, had they made any genuine attempt at all in the last 150 years to make amends and show respect, then my disposition would be different. But they've instead wasted the last century and a half, ignoring us at first, and then when they were forced to have to come to terms with the tide of history we represent, they instead of embracing us chose to insult us. They used us so that they could get a foothold in the door in the U.S., and then promptly spat in our faces and began to tell us that they were better than us and deny that racism even exists. The same attitude that led to the slave trade hasn't gone away, and we need to be honest about that. As Dr. John Henrik Clarke said, all history is a current event. Everything that has ever happened continues to happen. Now, to be sure, most Africans had nothing whatsoever to do with the slave trade, and I would even say that most Africans probably do not have the same level of enmity as their leaders have shown. But we have to be honest with ourselves about the fact that while a majority of them may not be with the BS, enough of them are, and certainly their leadership is. Colonialism would never have been possible had there not been a group of Africans who were eager to collaborate with the Europeans, a number of turncoat leaders who allowed the Europeans to do in Africa what they had been doing in Europe. Remember, whenever you find a group of people who are being oppressed, you always find that a number of them were complicit. No system of oppression can endure for the long term without turning some of the oppressed into collaborators in their own oppression. From Africa to the Caribbean, they all owe a huge debt of gratitude to us. We put reparations on the map. We did that. What happens in the U.S. reverberates around the world. But it wasn't the Nigerians or the Sudanese or the Haitians or the Jamaican immigrants in the U.S. who pushed for reparations. They were the main ones saying that we don't deserve it. Those immigrants who came here, they were the ones saying, well, reparations never gonna happen no how. You people, you need to have our work ethic, don't you know? People who want to ingratiate themselves with the white power structure one moment, and then the second they see us making some moves, they suddenly want to pretend to be down with the struggle the next. That don't wash. And neither do these Europeans in the UN saying stuff about reparations to suddenly have the same white nations who carried out the slave trade and colonialism suddenly saying that they want to atone. That sounds and smells like a trap to me. It sounds like offering reparations is like reparations for everyone. It sounds like that's what they're doing. And if I were an African citizen, I wouldn't be planning what blonde woman from Europe I would be spending that money on. The British are already holding firm on their position that they're not going to be paying reparations at all. They instead insist that the focus needs to be on learning lessons from history. That's hilarious coming from Britain's ruling party, the Tories, who have done everything they can to prohibit the teaching of history in Britain. And not to mention, though, it also tells us why people like Douglas Murray, another Brit, were so hot and bothered and furious about the idea of reparations in the United States. You have a white guy from Britain who was in a U.S. rag from Rupert Murdoch, the New York Post, saying that there shouldn't be reparations for black Americans. This guy's in Britain. Not a single penny would have come out of his pocket for reparations, but he understood that us agitating for reparations over here would also put a spine in black people in Britain to agitate for reparations over there. He understands what we do here sets the tone for the rest of the black world. Although the rest of the black world refuses to admit it, that's okay. The white supremacists see it. The only ones waving the flag for reparations has been us, full stop. Anyone else who says they have been is lying. We've had black people like the NAACP fighting against us, saying that cash reparations shouldn't be made. This issue is so threatening to white supremacy that it forces everyone to declare where they stand. You simply cannot support cash reparations without also being an open enemy of white supremacy. So you got the cowards, tools, turncoats, and bootlicks who get terrified and show their true colors. Oh yeah, they're worried about making massa unhappy. As usual, it's only after we do all the heavy lifting and the fighting that everyone else tiptoes in afterwards and begins talking tough, as if they had been down with the struggle from day one when they were the main ones standing on the sidelines saying, Massa, we aren't saying anything about reparations, so don't get mad at us. We have to establish a new normal. Those who do the work are the only ones who should get the rewards. White supremacy aims to maintain the unequal racial status quo it created by maintaining the racial wealth gap. If black people get something, then they automatically twist and pervert things to make sure everybody else gets something too, just to make sure that that racial wealth gap doesn't change. The detractors and naysayers have been slamming their gums for years, but we've remained on our square. Without us, none of the people who are currently talking about reparations for Africa or the Caribbean would even be saying a word about it. They sure as hell weren't saying anything before we started banging that drum. Without us, none of the white nations who are pretending to want to pay lip service to reparations would even be doing that much. This is why we're taking care of ourselves, family, why we're focusing on ourselves. And it's also why these other black groups outside the U.S., they should be supporting us on this as well. If they really want progress to be made, they need to be admitting to the reality that we represent. It may not make them happy, but it is the truth. Their own leaders in Haiti, Jamaica, and Africa would sell them out and pocket the money because that's what they've been doing all these decades. What they need is an actual model of black people who are focused on making sure the reparations translates into economic empowerment. And that's us. So to the black folks out there in California who have been putting in the work, and yeah, I'm talking about Brother Tariq, they can take a bow on this one. And all the fools who have been laughing and saying, well, who's reparations even going to apply to? You don't hear them laughing anymore, do you? Just like Fox News, instead of ridicule, now it's turned to anger. And that's how you know we're heading in the right direction. Good day, and be one. I'd like to take a moment to mention some of our contributors. I, Wesley Jones, G95, Zachary Jenkins, Fred Williams, and Nicholas Moore. Salute to them and thank you to everyone for listening, liking, and sharing this message. Black empowerment only exists because of you.